maidservant shouldn't steal the master's thunder. Now you look exactly like a stray dog.
Who touched you?
My stepmother.
In front of me. Never hide who you are. The way you are right now is flawless. We're going home now, my darling.
When the rusted shears severed my hair, my stepmother smiled, certain my future was permanently over. But the terrifying rumble of the Alpha King's carriage outside proved one thing: my reign, and her endless nightmare, were just beginning. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The rusted shears snapped shut, echoing hollowly across the freezing vanity room. Margaret anchored my head in place by twisting a fistful of my hair. She leaned close, her breath radiating the sour stench of stale wine. "A maid does not outshine her betters," she whispered against my ear. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the cracked mirror. I refused to blink, denying her the satisfaction of my tears. My golden hair remained the only inheritance from my mother. It tumbled down my back in long waves, a silent rebellion against the rags I wore. Margaret knew the emissaries would arrive before midnight. Tonight marked the choosing ceremony for the northern packs. She intended to secure high-ranking mates for her daughters at any cost. The blades parted again, sliding flush against the nape of my neck. Snip. A heavy lock of spun gold detached and dropped lifelessly to the floorboards. My breath hitched, but I forced my expression to remain entirely blank. Margaret worked quickly, her hands driven by unchecked jealousy. She hacked without precision, leaving jagged edges around my jawline. "There," she announced, stepping back to admire her work. She tossed the shears onto the table with a sharp clatter. "Now you look exactly like the stray dog you are." I stared at the stranger reflecting back at me in the glass. The golden curtain was gone, exposing the delicate line of my neck. She expected me to crumble to the floor in despair. Instead, the sudden chill against my bare skin felt remarkably like freedom. I stood up slowly, brushing the severed strands from my shoulders. I was lighter now, stripped of the very thing that made me a target. "I will survive this night," I promised myself silently. A sudden tremor vibrated heavily through the stone floor beneath us. The silver brushes on the vanity rattled against the polished wood. This was not the refined arrival of an aristocratic carriage. It sounded like a vanguard of war horses marching in perfect unison. Margaret rushed toward the barred window, her smug demeanor evaporating instantly. She gripped the iron bars, peering out into the darkness of the courtyard. "The Alpha King," she breathed out, the words choking in her throat. He was not supposed to be anywhere near our impoverished territory. Caleb was the supreme ruler of the North, a warlord who conquered rather than courted. He was known for his towering, muscular physique and a severe, close-cropped haircut that emphasized his ruthless nature. His reputation was painted in blood, not the polite diplomacy of these choosing ceremonies. Even from this high up, I felt the oppressive weight of his alpha aura bleeding through the walls. It made the air inside the room impossibly heavy to breathe. He had not come out here to search for a pretty girl with flowing hair. He was hunting tonight, driven by primal instincts no human could possibly comprehend. The reinforced oak doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They splintered violently inward, the iron hinges shrieking as they tore from the stone walls. A concussive shockwave of raw power rushed up the grand staircase. Margaret turned pale, her eyes darting around the room in pure panic. She grabbed my wrist tightly, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Get into the cellar right now," she hissed, dragging me toward the hidden servants' stairs. She was terrified his gaze would fall upon my ruined state and trigger his anger. We burst out onto the open mezzanine just as he stepped into the main hall below us. The high-contrast light from the wall torches cast deep, dramatic shadows across his chiseled face. He stood perfectly still, a mountain of raw muscle and dark dominance. Every noble, servant, and guard in the room fell to their knees in immediate submission. He completely ignored the bowing crowds surrounding him. He did not even glance at Margaret's daughters weeping in fear near the fireplace. His golden, predatory eyes snapped upward and locked directly onto the mezzanine. He found me instantly in the gloom. All the air vanished from my lungs. He catalogued every detail of my appearance in a fraction of a second. He saw the brutal, uneven chops of my freshly cut hair. He saw the rigid defiance in my posture. He saw Margaret's grip bruising my wrist. A low, terrifying rumble started deep within his broad chest. It was a primordial sound that rattled the crystal chandelier hanging above us. Margaret froze, realizing too late she was standing in the crosshairs of a god of war. The Alpha King took one deliberate step toward the base of the staircase. "Mine," he roared, the single command shaking the foundations of the estate. Margaret let go of my arm and collapsed onto the stone floor in pure terror. She had cut my hair tonight specifically to ensure I remained entirely unwanted. She had no idea she had just provoked the single most dangerous creature alive. The single word echoed through the freezing hall like a physical blow. Margaret whimpered, pressing her face against the cold stone floor. She trembled, finally realizing the magnitude of her fatal mistake. Caleb did not spare the groveling woman a downward glance. His heavy boots hit the marble steps of the staircase with deliberate thuds. Each purposeful stride sounded like a death knell for the ruling family. The local lords frantically backed away, flattening themselves against the walls. They were terrified to even draw a breath in his presence. I stood frozen on the mezzanine, my pulse pounding relentlessly against my eardrums. The Alpha King was ascending directly toward me. His broad shoulders seemed to block out all the flickering light from the chandeliers. The sharp scent of pine, winter frost, and raw power preceded him. It was an addictive aroma that made my inner wolf stir deeply within my chest. I had never felt such an overwhelming instinct to submit, yet I simultaneously felt utterly safe. He reached the top of the stairs and stopped mere inches from my frame. Up close, his towering build was even more intimidating. His jawline was clenched tight, a muscle ticking beneath his tan skin. He raised one scarred hand slowly toward my face. I flinched backward out of sheer habit, fully expecting the strike of a master. Instead, his rough fingertips brushed agonizingly gently against my jaw. He tenderly traced the ruined ends of my freshly shorn hair. His golden eyes darkened instantly to a terrifying, bottomless shade of black. A vicious growl ripped through the sudden silence of the room. "Who touched you?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a lethal vibration. He did not yell, but the quiet menace was infinitely worse than any scream. I swallowed hard, entirely unable to break the magnetic hold of his gaze. "My stepmother," I whispered, the dangerous truth slipping out before I could stop it. Caleb slowly turned his head to look down at the woman on the ground floor. The murderous intent rolling off his body was suffocating. "Bring that creature here," Caleb commanded smoothly to his elite guard. Two northern enforcers immediately dragged Margaret up the sweeping staircase. She sobbed hysterically, her elegant gown dragging uselessly over the dirty steps. They threw her down violently at Caleb's steel-toed boots. "My king, please try to understand," Margaret babbled, her voice shrinking with panic. "She is a defiant creature, completely unsuited for your presence." Caleb did not even look at her while she spoke her desperate lies. His burning gaze remained entirely fixated on my pale face. He gently reached out and took my left arm, turning my wrist to expose the tender skin. The dark bruises from Margaret's grip were clearly stamped into my flesh. "You dared to mark what is inherently mine," Caleb stated, his tone devoid of any mercy. He finally shifted his gaze down to Margaret, his expression carved from pure ice. "You dared to destroy the crown of my future Luna." Margaret gasped loudly, all the remaining blood draining instantly from her face. The entire massive hall erupted in shocked, breathless gasps. Aluna was not just a mere mate, she was the sacred queen of the entire pack. "No, my alpha, she is nothing but a lowly servant." Margaret shrieked desperately. "Silence," Caleb barked, the single command radiating with bone-crushing alpha power. Margaret's jaws snapped shut instantly against her own will, her teeth clicking loudly. "Strip this deceitful family of their noble titles, their stolen lands, and all their wealth," Caleb ordered his men. "Throw them out into the unforgiving winter woods tonight with only the thin clothes on their backs." Margaret collapsed completely into a dead faint, hitting the hard floor with a hollow thud. Her spoiled daughters screamed from the far corner, finally comprehending their absolute ruin. Caleb ignored the pathetic chaos unfolding around him with practiced indifference. He unclasped his fur-lined winter cloak with one incredibly swift motion. He wrapped the warm garment securely around my trembling shoulders. The heavy fabric swallowed me whole, smelling fiercely of his masculine scent. "You are leaving this wretched place tonight," he promised softly, his tone meant only for my ears. He scooped me up effortlessly into his strong arms, handling me as if I weighed absolutely nothing. I gasped in surprise, instinctively wrapping my arms tightly around his muscular neck. He held me incredibly securely against his solid chest, shielding me completely from the staring crowd. "We are going home now, my resilient little wolf," he murmured warmly, pressing his firm lips against my temple. With his precious prize finally secured, the towering Alpha King carried me down the stairs and out into the howling night. I buried my face against his collarbone as we crossed the ruined threshold of the estate. The frigid winter wind whipped around us, but I felt absolutely no cold within his embrace. Dozens of elite Alpha warriors stood at absolute attention in the snow-covered courtyard. They bowed their heads in deep reverence as their king emerged with me in his arms. A massive, armor-plated carriage drawn by 6 monstrous wolves waited at the center of the formation. The beasts growled low in their throats, sensing the overwhelming power radiating from Caleb. He did not set me down as we approached the imposing iron carriage. One of his captains quickly scrambled forward to pull open the heavy door. Caleb ducked his tall frame and stepped seamlessly into the surprisingly warm interior. The carriage cabin was lined with the finest pelts and heated by a small ember stone. He gently deposited me onto the plush velvet cushions, taking the seat immediately beside me. His large frame took up most of the space, creating a protective barrier against the outside world. The captain slammed the heavy door shut, sealing us completely inside the luxurious cabin. The sudden silence between us was heavy, charged with an undeniable tension. I pulled the fur cloak tighter around my body, suddenly acutely aware of my own vulnerability. Caleb leaned back against the cushions, studying me with a devastatingly intense focus. I lowered my gaze, ashamed of the jagged ruins of my once beautiful hair. I reached a trembling hand up, trying desperately to cover the uneven edges near my neck. Caleb reached out instantly, gently wrapping his warm fingers around my wrist. He slowly pulled my hand away from my face, refusing to let me hide from him. "Never cover yourself in my presence," he commanded softly, his deep voice wrapping around me like a physical caress. "You are perfectly flawless exactly as you are, my brave survivor." He lifted his other hand and gently brushed a stray, severed strand from my cheek. The raw tenderness in his touch completely contradicted the brutal warlord everyone feared. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and rolled slowly down my pale cheek. He caught the tear with his thumb, wiping it away before it could fall. Margaret will pay for every single drop of sorrow she has ever caused you, he vowed darkly. The massive wolves outside let out a unified, terrifying howl that shook the ground. The carriage lurched forward, beginning our long journey toward the frozen northern territories. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against his solid shoulder, finally allowing myself to rest. For the first time in my entire miserable life, I genuinely believed I was entirely safe. The relentless, howling blizzard hammered aggressively against the thick armored sides of the massive iron carriage. Inside the magically heated cabin, the rhythmic swaying of the heavy wheels finally lulled my exhausted, trembling body into a deep sleep. I slumped sideways without realizing it, my pale cheek coming to rest directly against the immovable muscle of Caleb's broad, powerful chest. He did not push me away or issue a harsh reprimand about the highly improper physical contact between a lowly servant and a supreme king. Instead, his incredibly large, battle-scarred hand instinctively curled around my narrow waist to keep me perfectly steady over the rough, mountainous terrain. Through the hazy fog of my desperate slumber, I felt the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his powerful heart right beneath my ear. It was a remarkably steady, deeply grounding drumbeat that effectively chased away the lingering, terrifying nightmares of Margaret's lifelong cruelty. When I finally fluttered my heavy eyelids open, several long hours had clearly passed in total, uninterrupted darkness outside the frosted windows. The glowing ember stone in the corner cast harsh, dramatic, high-contrast shadows across Caleb's deeply chiseled jaw and sharp, aristocratic cheekbones. His severe, close-cropped hair gave him the completely unforgiving, intimidating look of a seasoned battlefield commander who had seen countless brutal wars. Yet, the luminous golden eyes staring down intently at my face held a surprisingly strange, deeply calculated gentleness that confused my racing heart. "You slept for a very long time, my resilient little wolf," he murmured softly, his incredibly deep voice vibrating pleasantly right through my spine. I quickly sat up straight, suddenly becoming hyper-aware of exactly how intimately I had been clinging to the most terrifying alpha king in the entire realm. "I sincerely apologize, my king," I stammered nervously, pulling the heavy, masculine fur cloak tightly around my exposed neck to hide my ruined hair. He frowned slightly, his dark brows pulling together as he was clearly displeased by my sudden display of fearful submission and emotional distance. "You will absolutely never apologize for seeking basic comfort from your destined mate," he commanded, his firm tone leaving absolutely no room for any further argument. He leaned his massive upper body significantly closer, taking a slow, deeply deliberate breath near the jagged, uneven ruins of my freshly severed golden hair. His brow furrowed even deeper as his magically enhanced predatory senses picked up something completely hidden beneath the obvious scent of winter cold and lingering human fear. "There is something entirely unique about your ancestral bloodline, my brave Audrey," he stated very quietly, his piercing gaze cutting right through my soul. "There is a dormant, ancient sweetness running through your veins that no ordinary human servant could possibly possess in this realm." My heart skipped a violently painful beat, a sudden, overwhelming wave of dark anxiety washing over my newly recovering senses. I had always been repeatedly told that my mother was just a pathetic, nameless wanderer who tragically died while giving birth to me in the dirt. Before I could gather the courage to ask him exactly what he meant by those strange words, the massive iron carriage ground to a sudden, violently jarring halt. The heavy, reinforced iron door swung open with a loud screech, immediately letting in a vicious, blinding blast of freezing, snow-laden northern wind. We had finally arrived at the legendary, terrifying obsidian fortress of the supreme northern pack. Massive, jagged stone towers pierced directly into the blackened night sky, intensely illuminated by roaring courtyard bonfires that painted the entire stone compound in stark, violent orange and deep, suffocating black. Hundreds of massive, battle-hardened werewolf warriors stood rigidly in perfectly straight, disciplined formations, waiting silently to greet their returning warlord. Caleb stepped out fearlessly into the howling snowstorm first, his towering, overwhelmingly muscular frame completely dominating the chaotic, freezing landscape in an instant. He turned around slowly and offered his incredibly massive, heavily calloused hand to help me carefully navigate down the treacherously steep, icy iron steps. I hesitated for a terrifying fraction of a second, deeply intimidated by the hundreds of glowing, predatory eyes immediately fixing upon my fragile form. I forced myself to take a deep breath, securely grabbing his warm hand, and stepped out into the brutal northern winter with my chin held as fiercely high as I could possibly manage. Audible gasps of raw, unfiltered shock rippled violently through the elite military ranks as they collectively took in my ragged, unwashed appearance and uneven, brutally chopped hair. They had fully expected a pampered, flawlessly beautiful, high-ranking aristocrat to emerge confidently as their glorious new Luna, not a bruised, shivering survivor wrapped in oversized furs. A remarkably tall, highly imposing female warrior standing aggressively near the front line actively curled her upper lip in a very obvious, disrespectful sneer of pure disgust. This broken, ugly little human creature is genuinely meant to lead our glorious pack, she muttered disrespectfully, her venomous voice carrying sharply on the freezing wind. Caleb's reaction to her blatant disrespect was completely instantaneous and utterly, mind-numbingly terrifying for everyone to witness. He did not bother to raise his deep voice, nor did he even attempt to draw the heavy, lethal iron blade securely strapped to his muscular, imposing thigh. He simply unleashed the full, overwhelmingly suffocating weight of his supreme alpha aura directly onto the insolent, foolish female warrior without any hesitation. The immense, invisible pressure instantly cracked the solid cobblestone directly beneath her heavy winter boots, violently forcing her down to her knees in agonizing, immediate, and totally undeniable submission. "She is your undisputed queen," Caleb declared coldly to the completely silent, violently trembling courtyard, his booming voice echoing like lethal thunder against the stone walls. "Anyone who ever dares to question her infinite worth or disrespect her presence will have to answer directly to my sharpest teeth." He seamlessly and effortlessly scooped my entire body back up into his strong arms, violently refusing to let my bare, freezing feet touch the cold, unwelcoming snow for another second. He carried me proudly and fiercely right past the kneeling, terrified legions, his long, strong strides taking us deep into the fiery, protected heart of his impenetrable, ancient stronghold. I instinctively buried my face deeply in the crook of his warm neck, secretly hiding a very small, entirely unfamiliar smile against his surprisingly soft skin. The vast northern territory was undeniably hostile and deeply dangerous, but I clearly had the single most dangerous, powerful monster in the entire world entirely on my side. The heavy oak doors of the Alpha King's private chambers slammed shut with a resounding thud. Caleb did not put me down until we were standing entirely alone in the center of the massive room. He gently lowered my bare feet onto the thick, exceptionally soft fur rug spread before a roaring fireplace. The blazing hearth cast a deep, dramatic orange glow across one half of the spacious sanctuary. The other half was completely bathed in the stark, silver light of a massive full moon pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. This intense, high-contrast lighting heavily accentuated the sharp, unforgiving planes of his fiercely handsome face. It also highlighted the powerful, muscular tension in his incredibly broad shoulders as he stepped back to properly look at me. He ran a rough, scarred hand through his severely cut short hair, exhaling a long, ragged breath. I stood perfectly still, clutching the heavy winter cloak tightly around my trembling shoulders. The terrifying warlord who had just brought an entire elite legion to its knees was now looking at me with completely undisguised devotion. "You are finally safe, my beautiful survivor," he promised quietly, the deep timbre of his voice echoing against the ancient stone walls. "No one in this entire world will ever be allowed to raise a hand against you again." He turned away slowly and walked toward an ornate silver basin resting on a heavy wooden stand. He poured steaming water from an iron pitcher, the warm mist rising swiftly into the frigid air of the imposing castle. He grabbed a clean, soft linen cloth and submerged it completely into the heated water. When he walked back to me, his golden eyes were entirely focused on the jagged, uneven ends of my ruined hair. "Allow me to tend to your wounds," he requested softly, extending his exceptionally large hand toward the clasp of my cloak. I hesitated for a fleeting moment before finally forcing my nervous fingers to release the heavy fabric. The thick fur slipped off my shoulders and pulled silently on the floor completely around my ankles. I was left standing in the faded, torn cotton dress that Margaret had viciously forced me to wear for years. The jagged scratches on my delicate neck from the rusty shears were now fully exposed to the open air. The dark, painful bruises left by my stepmother's cruel grip completely encircled my pale, fragile wrists. A terrifying, low growl instantly vibrated deep within Caleb's formidable chest as he took in the full extent of my injuries. His sharp jaw clenched so tightly that I genuinely feared his teeth might shatter under the immense pressure. He did not allow his raging anger to dictate his physical movements toward my vulnerable form. He stepped into my personal space with the measured, careful grace of an apex predator approaching something incredibly fragile. He gently took my injured arm, his massive, calloused fingers completely dwarfing my small wrist. The warm, damp linen cloth felt remarkably soothing against the throbbing, irritated skin of my neck. He meticulously wiped away the dried blood, his touch unbearably tender for a commanding man known only for ruthless war. "I should have killed her the very second I saw what she did to you," he murmured darkly into the quiet room. As he spoke, he subtly shifted my position, guiding me entirely unknowingly into the direct path of the moonlight. The piercing, brilliant silver beams cut directly through the darkness of the room and washed completely over my exposed skin. I immediately felt a strange, deeply unfamiliar tingling sensation blooming rapidly beneath the surface of my flesh. It was not painful, but rather a profoundly warm, effervescent humming that started directly within my beating heart. Caleb froze completely, the wet linen cloth hovering completely motionless an inch away from my collarbone. His highly enhanced, predatory golden eyes widened considerably in absolute, unfiltered shock. I followed his intense gaze downward, staring in utter disbelief at my own damaged wrist. The deep, purple bruises left by Margaret were visibly fading away right before my very own eyes. The broken blood vessels beneath my pale skin were actively knitting themselves back together at an entirely impossible speed. A faint, almost imperceptible silver luminescence seemed to radiate directly from the magically closing wounds. I gasped sharply, instinctively trying to pull my arm away in a sudden wave of pure panic. "Do not move," Caleb commanded urgently, his voice entirely breathless as he gently tightened his protective grip. He dropped the linen cloth onto the floor and carefully tilted my chin upward with his other hand. He stared intensely at the jagged scratches on my neck, watching as the broken skin seamlessly fused back into flawless perfection. Within mere seconds, there was absolutely no physical evidence left of the terrible abuse I had endured earlier that evening. My skin was perfectly smooth, completely unblemished, and faintly glowing under the celestial moonlight. I looked up at the towering Alpha King, my heart violently hammering against my ribs in pure terror. "What is happening to me?" I whispered desperately, completely terrified that he would now view me as a cursed monster. I fully expected the notoriously ruthless warlord to draw his heavy blade and eliminate the unnatural threat standing in his bedroom. Instead, Caleb slowly fell to one knee right directly in front of my bare feet. The most feared man in the entire Northern Hemisphere lowered his proud, short-haired head in absolute, profound reverence. He gently brought my newly healed wrist directly to his warm lips and pressed a deeply devotional kiss against my racing pulse point. "You are not merely a human servant, my incredible Audrey," he stated with absolute, unshakable certainty. He looked up at me, his striking golden eyes blazing with an intoxicating mixture of deep awe and fierce possessiveness. "That miraculous healing is the undeniable, legendary mark of the original lunar bloodline." I shook my head frantically, completely unable to comprehend the entirely impossible words leaving his mouth. "My mother was just a beggar," I argued weakly, the lifelong lies instilled by Margaret fiercely fighting against this sudden revelation. Your mother was likely the last surviving descendant of the ancient Fey wolves, Caleb corrected gently but firmly. Your royal blood carries the pure, undiluted essence of the moon goddess herself. He stood up slowly, his towering, highly muscular frame once again dominating the entire space completely around us. Margaret did not just abuse a defenseless orphan inside her miserable home. A terrifying, profoundly bloodthirsty smile slowly curved the corners of his handsome mouth. She foolishly tortured the most sacred, powerful creature to ever walk this earth. He reached out and gently cupped my cheek, his rough thumb slowly tracing my perfectly healed, flawless skin. The entire realm will bow to you, my queen, and anyone who ever doubted you will beg mercilessly for your forgiveness. The immense, undeniable power radiating from his confident words finally shattered the last remaining wall of my lifelong insecurity. I leaned my face instinctively into the rough warmth of his incredibly large hand. The comforting scent of winter pine and dark amber wrapped securely around my newly awakened senses like a protective shield. For the first time in my entire existence, I did not feel the desperate urge to hide my true self in the shadows. If I truly possessed the ancient blood of the goddess, I was absolutely no longer a helpless victim waiting to be rescued. I looked directly into Caleb's fierce golden eyes, feeling an ancient, dormant power finally clicking into place within my soul. Then we will make them regret everything they have ever done, I whispered boldly, my voice surprisingly steady and clear. Caleb let out a low, deeply satisfied growl of absolute, unbridled approval. With immense pleasure, my beautiful, unbreakable Luna, he vowed, sealing his deadly promise with a fierce, highly intoxicating kiss. The voyage across the Atlantic Ocean lasted 6 long weeks. For Evelyn, every day at sea was a baptism of salt and wind. The grand, suffocating world of the British aristocracy faded with every league the ship traveled west. She did not suffer from seasickness. Instead, she spent hours on the wooden deck, watching the endless blue waves. The cold ocean breeze stung her cheeks, but it felt clean. It felt real. In her small, cramped cabin, she spent her nights reading her grandmother's journals and planning her future. She was no longer the ornamental fiancée of a wealthy duke. She was simply Evelyn, a woman with a pocket full of gold and a mind of her own. When the ship finally anchored in Boston Harbor, the sight took her breath away. It was nothing like the grey, rigid elegance of London. Boston was a surge of raw, chaotic energy. The docks were alive with the shouts of sailors, the clatter of horse-drawn wagons, and the heavy scent of pine timber and molasses. People moved with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with lineage or titles. Here, a person's worth was measured by their labor, not their ancestors. Evelyn stepped off the gangplank, carrying her single leather bag. She took a deep breath of the sharp, crisp New England air and smiled. Her first task was to find a safe place to live. She avoided the grand hotels, choosing instead a quiet boarding house in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. The landlady, a sharp-witted widow named Mrs. Gable, looked at Evelyn's refined posture and simple clothes with curiosity. "You look like a lady who has run away from something," Mrs. Gable said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am a woman who has run toward something," Evelyn replied calmly, handing over 2 weeks' rent in advance. Mrs. Gable counted the silver coins, her expression softening into a look of approval. "Fair enough. Your room is at the top of the stairs. Keep it clean, and breakfast is at 7 sharp." The room was small, with a narrow iron bed, a wooden washstand, and a single window overlooking the cobblestone street. To Evelyn, it felt like a palace of absolute freedom. She spent her first week exploring the city, learning the geography of her new home. She realized very quickly that her small inheritance would not last forever. She needed an income. Back in London, a lady of her status would never dream of working. It was considered a disgrace. But in Boston, Independence was a badge of honor. Evelyn possessed an exceptional talent for mathematics and organization, a skill her father had secretly nurtured before his passing. She noticed that many of the merchants along the wharf struggled to keep their financial ledgers accurate. On a crisp Tuesday morning, she walked into the office of Mr. Vance, a prominent shipping merchant. Mr. Vance was surrounded by tall stacks of chaotic paperwork, looking thoroughly exhausted. "Good morning, sir," Evelyn said, her voice steady and professional. "I notice your shipping logs are backing up." Mr. Vance glanced up, frowning at the young, beautiful woman standing before him. "And what concern is that of yours, young miss?" he asked gruffly. "I can balance your books in half the time it takes your current clerks, and I will find the missing 3% in your tariff discrepancies," she stated flatly. The merchant stared at her, amused but desperate. "You think a girl can handle merchant banking?" "Give me 3 hours," Evelyn challenged, removing her gloves. "If my numbers are wrong, you do not have to pay me a single dime." By mid-afternoon, the chaos on Mr. Vance's desk was gone. Every column matched perfectly. She had even discovered a significant billing error that saved him $50. Mr. Vance looked at the immaculate ledger, then at Evelyn, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Who taught you to do this?" he murmured. "My father," she said simply. "Do I have the position?" Mr. Vance let out a loud laugh and extended his hand. "You start tomorrow at 8, Miss Evelyn. The salary is $12 a week." As she walked back to her boarding house that evening, the sunset painted the Boston sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. She felt a deep, profound sense of pride blooming in her chest. She had earned her own bread today. She belonged to no one but herself. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away across the ocean, a very different storm was brewing. A letter arrived at Mrs. Gable's boarding house a month later, forwarded through a secret chain of mail couriers Evelyn had established. The wax seal bore the crest of the Dowager Duchess of Sterling. Evelyn broke the seal with steady fingers. The letter was brief, written in Margaret's sharp, elegant handwriting. "Dear Evelyn," the letter read. "Julian discovered your absence at noon on the day you left." The panic in his eyes was magnificent. Evelyn felt a small, cold smile touch her lips as she continued reading. "He tried to claim you were kidnapped, but the sapphire ring on the vanity silenced him. Lydia expected him to marry her immediately to save her reputation, but I have cut off his personal allowance. A duke with no coin is a remarkably unattractive prospect. Lydia's family has packed her off to the countryside in disgrace." Margaret's letter concluded with a line that brought a tear of gratitude to Evelyn's eye. "You have set this house on fire, my dear, and I am enjoying the warmth. Live well in America. You are the daughter I always wished I had." Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer. She looked out her window at the bustling American city below. The past was dead. Her new life had truly begun. Margaret dragged her frozen feet through the knee-deep snow of the desolate northern borderlands. The bitter wind sliced through her thin silk dress, a cruel reminder of the immense wealth she had violently lost. Her daughter, Beatrice, stumbled beside her with blue lips and severely frostbitten fingers. They had been wandering in the lethal darkness for an eternity since Caleb banished them. The towering Alpha King had entirely stripped them of their aristocratic titles and thrown them to the unforgiving elements. Margaret's heart burned with a toxic, consuming hatred that temporarily warded off the freezing temperatures. She refused to die out here in the dirt while that pathetic, short-haired servant girl sat on a royal throne. She desperately needed a weapon powerful enough to slaughter the most dangerous werewolf warlord in the entire realm. As the high-contrast silver moonlight pierced the dense canopy of dead pines, a massive shadow detached itself from the tree line. A sleek, obsidian carriage drawn by 4 monstrously deformed horses halted silently in the unbroken snow. The heavy velvet curtains parted, revealing the terrifying, aristocratic silhouette of Lord Julian. He was a high-ranking immortal of the Eastern Vampire Coven, the ancient and sworn blood enemies of the Northern Pacts. Julian stepped gracefully onto the frozen ground, his crimson eyes gleaming with cold, calculated amusement. He looked down at the shivering, desperate women kneeling pathetically in the blood-stained snow. "It is incredibly rare to find human nobility wandering my borders as fresh prey," Julian purred softly. His voice carried a hypnotic, lethal edge that paralyzed Beatrice completely. Margaret forced herself to stand up upright, violently ignoring the agonizing pain in her frozen joints. She knew vampires were utterly devoid of mercy, but they were also driven by an insatiable hunger for supreme power. "I am not prey, my lord," Margaret declared, her voice trembling but heavily laced with pure malice. "I am a messenger carrying the single most valuable secret in this entire world. I know exactly what King Caleb is hiding inside his impenetrable obsidian fortress." Julian raised a pale, elegant eyebrow, mildly intrigued by the audacious mortal standing before him. He gestured casually for her to continue, his long fangs subtly grazing his lower lip in anticipation. "He claims to have found his destined Luna, but she is absolutely not a normal werewolf," Margaret revealed venomously. Her blood healed fatal wounds in mere seconds under the moonlight. "She is the last living descendant of the original Lunar goddess, and her bloodline is completely pure." The bored amusement instantly vanished from the vampire lord's striking face. The ancient, sacred blood of the moon goddess was a legendary, mythic prize. For a vampire, consuming such divine blood would grant unparalleled invincibility and complete immunity to sunlight. Julian's crimson eyes dilated completely, a terrifying, predatory hunger rapidly replacing his previous aristocratic calm. If the Alpha King managed to fully bond with the pureblood Luna, the northern werewolf packs would become entirely unstoppable. "You have my absolute attention, human," Julian whispered dangerously, closing the distance between them in a blurry flash of unnatural speed. "Tell me exactly how to breach his formidable defenses, and I will personally grant you the bloody revenge you desperately crave." Margaret smiled wickedly, her grotesque expression violently twisted by dark ambition and freezing frost. She outlined a treacherous plan utilizing the forgotten underground servant tunnels she had mapped out during her previous diplomatic visits. She was more than willing to sell out the entire Northern Territory if it meant watching Audrey suffer. Meanwhile, deep inside the heavily fortified inner sanctum of the Obsidian Fortress, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Caleb stood perfectly motionless on the high stone balcony, his severe, short hair whipped fiercely by the violent winter winds. The blazing fire pits in the courtyard below cast extreme, high-contrast shadows across his towering, heavily muscular physique. He possessed an unnatural, primal intuition that currently roared with aggressive warnings of an unseen, approaching threat. His golden eyes scanned the darkened tree line relentlessly, searching for any subtle break in the frozen landscape. Audrey approached him quietly from the comforting warmth of the royal bedchamber. She wore a simple white sleeping gown, her short, jagged hair framing her face with a striking, undeniable defiance. She reached out and placed her warm, delicate hand squarely against the dense, rigid muscle of his broad back. "Your heart is racing, my king," she noted softly, stepping close enough to completely absorb his radiating body heat. Caleb turned immediately, wrapping his massive, scarred arm securely around her narrow waist. He pulled her flush against his solid chest, burying his face carefully into the crook of her neck. He inhaled her intoxicating, divine scent deeply, actively trying to calm the violent, possessive beast clawing viciously at his insides. "The darkness is actively gathering along our borders, my beautiful Luna," Caleb murmured, his incredibly deep voice vibrating heavily against her skin. "I can smell the foul stench of ancient leeches plotting in the freezing wind. They have undoubtedly caught the divine scent of your awakened bloodline." Audrey did not pull away or tremble in fear at the grim mention of the immortal vampire threat. The miraculous healing power thrumming relentlessly through her veins had permanently erased the fragile, terrified servant girl she used to be. She tilted her chin up, looking directly into the fierce, golden eyes of her fiercely protective warlord. "Let them come," Audrey stated with absolute, unwavering conviction. "We will turn the white snow completely red with their ashes." Caleb let out a low, deeply satisfied growl of pure alpha approval. He claimed her lips in a bruising, deeply passionate kiss that promised absolute devastation to anyone who dared to cross their path. The lethal trap was already being set in the shadows, but the Alpha King and his pureblood queen were more than ready for a brutal, unforgiving war. The suffocating darkness of the hidden underground servant tunnels perfectly masked the lethal advance of the Eastern Vampire Coven. Margaret proudly led the immortal predators through the damp, narrow corridors, her wicked heart violently pounding with a toxic mixture of paralyzing fear and vindictive triumph. She carefully guided Lord Julian and his bloodthirsty elite guard past the heavy iron gates that usually protected the lower armory. The ancient, freezing stone walls of the obsidian fortress echoed subtly with the faint whisper of expensive silk and unsheathed, poisoned blades. Wall torches mounted along the rugged stone corridors flickered wildly in the draught, casting severe, high-contrast shadows that aggressively distorted the intruders into monstrous silhouettes. Margaret vividly envisioned the imminent, bloody destruction of her despised stepdaughter. She firmly believed the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the undead horde would easily crush even the most formidable werewolf defenses. She eagerly anticipated the glorious, highly satisfying sight of the untouchable Alpha King being forced to painfully watch his newly claimed queen fall. They burst violently out of the hidden grates and instantly swarmed the lower courtyard like a devastating plague of starving locusts. The element of surprise was supposed to be their ultimate, unstoppable weapon, but King Caleb possessed the finely tuned, supernatural instincts of an apex predator. Before any vampire could even attempt to breach the heavy doors of the inner keep, a deafening, chest-rattling roar completely shattered the fragile winter silence. Massive iron braziers deliberately positioned around the perimeter of the courtyard were instantly ignited by the defending guards, fiercely illuminating the entire bloody battlefield. The explosive, high-contrast blaze of vibrant orange fire aggressively fought against the deep, pitch-black shadows of the night. Standing fearlessly at the very top of the grand stone staircase was Caleb. His towering, incredibly muscular frame completely blocked the main entrance, creating a terrifying, immovable monument of pure, unadulterated alpha dominance. His severe, military-style short hair blew sharply in the freezing wind, and his glowing golden eyes burned with a murderous, entirely unholy wrath. He was not a vulnerable king caught completely off guard, he was a brutal warlord actively welcoming a long-overdue slaughter. The elite werewolf warriors rapidly descended from the high battlements, crashing violently into the hissing vampire horde with devastating, bone-crushing force. The pristine, snow-covered courtyard instantly transformed into a chaotic, terrifying theater of brutal carnage. Caleb did not bother issuing complex tactical commands to his seasoned generals, he threw himself directly into the thickest, most dangerous part of the raging melee. His immense, terrifying physical strength allowed him to effortlessly rip the undead intruders apart with his bare, heavily calloused hands. Every calculated movement of his powerful, densely muscular body was a lethal strike, entirely fueled by his desperate, obsessive need to protect his destined mate resting in the tower above. Lord Julian sneered disdainfully from the edge of the conflict, cowardly commanding his fastest, most agile assassins to completely bypass the raging alpha and target the royal chambers directly. Margaret watched eagerly from the safety of a deeply shadowed archway, tightly gripping the cold stone wall in sick anticipation as the silent assassins scaled the fortress walls with unnatural, terrifying agility. Inside the sprawling royal chambers, Audrey absolutely did not cower in the dark corners or attempt to hide beneath the heavy winter furs. She stood perfectly still in the exact center of the vast room, fully and fearlessly bathed in the brilliant, piercing silver light continuously pouring through the massive glass windows. Her jagged, Freshly cut short hair beautifully framed her pale face, heavily highlighting a newfound, entirely unshakable resolve that completely erased her past victimhood. As the heavy wooden doors violently splintered inward and heavily armed, blood-soaked vampire assassins lunged directly toward her, she did not even flinch or scream. Instead, she closed her eyes and tapped directly into the ancient, humming energy fiercely coursing through her royal veins. The miraculous, legendary healing power of the lunar goddess was not merely a passive defensive mechanism, it was a devastating, aggressively offensive weapon against any corrupted creature born of the deep darkness. A blinding, completely pure silver shockwave violently erupted from her delicate frame, expanding outward with utterly impossible speed and terrifying, divine force. The divine, intensely radiant light hit the approaching vampire assassins like a solid, physical wall of holy fire. They shrieked in absolute, agonizing torment as the pure, undiluted essence of the moon violently burned away their cursed, immortal flesh. Rapidly, the lethal, terrifying threats were entirely reduced to nothing more than fine, drifting dark ash falling silently onto the thick decorative rugs. The radiant, divine shockwave absolutely did not stop within the tight confines of the bedroom. It cascaded aggressively down the exterior stone walls and completely flooded the chaotic courtyard below, casting an ethereal, blindingly high-contrast glow over the entire bloody battlefield. The vampires unfortunately caught in the sudden lunar blast screamed desperately as their pale skin violently blistered, cracked, and disintegrated under the intense divine exposure. Lord Julian, immediately realizing the catastrophic, fatal error of his greedy ambition, completely abandoned his doomed, burning forces without a single backward glance. He swiftly transformed into a thin dark mist and fled desperately into the freezing northern wilderness, mercilessly leaving his entire elite coven to burn in the blinding, purifying light of the true Luna. Margaret stood completely paralyzed and breathless in her hidden archway, helplessly watching her grand, vindictive scheme rapidly disintegrate into absolute, irreversible ruin. The overwhelming, divine power actively radiating from her formerly abused stepdaughter was something she could never have possibly comprehended or anticipated in her wildest, darkest dreams. As the last of the invading vampires permanently crumbled into useless ash, the blinding silver light slowly faded away, leaving only the fierce, crackling orange glow of the courtyard fires illuminating the carnage. The brutal battle was decisively and completely over. Caleb, his bare, heavily muscled chest heaving heavily with physical exertion and darkly stained with the black blood of his defeated enemies, turned his terrifying, glowing golden gaze directly toward the archway. His supernatural, highly enhanced senses had effortlessly tracked Margaret's sour, cowardly sense straight through the absolute chaos of the battlefield. He purposefully crossed the ruined courtyard in a few massive, ground-shaking strides and reached aggressively into the dark shadows. He dragged the terrified, hysterically sobbing woman forcefully out into the harsh, unforgiving firelight, throwing her violently onto the blood-soaked cobblestones right beneath his heavy boots. There would be absolutely no mercy and no escape for her this time. The devastating aftermath of the brutal vampire siege left the obsidian fortress reeking heavily of dark ash and spilled werewolf blood. A fierce, howling blizzard immediately swept through the rugged mountain pass, burying the grotesque remains of the undead horde and aggressively purifying the sacred grounds of the Northern Territory. King Caleb stood in the absolute center of the ruined stone courtyard, his towering, intensely muscular physique radiating an oppressive, lethal heat that melted the falling snowflakes before they could even brush against his bare, deeply scarred chest. His severe, military-cut short hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his glowing golden eyes remained locked in a state of primal, unyielding fury. Extreme, high-contrast shadows danced violently across his chiseled jawline as the perimeter bonfires flared in the wind. He forcefully dragged Margaret out from the darkness and threw her violently onto the blood-stained cobblestones. The treacherous stepmother collapsed into a pathetic, shivering heap, her expensive silk gown now completely soaked in freezing slush in the dark, powdery remnants of the immortal enemies she had foolishly invited into their home. The surviving elite warriors of the Northern Pack rapidly formed a massive, impenetrable circle around the courtyard. They did not cheer their profound tactical victory. Instead, they stood in absolute, terrifying silence, waiting patiently for their ruthless alpha to deliver his final, devastating judgment. Margaret coughed violently, spitting dark blood and melting snow from her trembling lips. She looked frantically up at the massive warlord, desperately searching his carved, aristocratic face for even a single shred of mercy. She found absolutely nothing but an endless, completely frozen abyss of murderous intent. You deliberately brought ancient, parasitic leeches into my heavily fortified home, Caleb stated coldly, his incredibly deep voice resonating like rolling thunder against the damaged stone walls. You actively plotted the brutal assassination of my loyal warriors, and you dared to target the sacred, pure life of my destined mate. Margaret scrambled desperately onto her heavily bruised knees, shaking her head frantically as tears of pure, unadulterated terror streamed down her ruined face. She knew the ancient northern laws dictated immediate, excruciating execution for the crime of high treason. Please, my merciful lord, I was brutally deceived, she screamed hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly in the deeply tense atmosphere. The vampire lord forced my hand. I only wanted to ensure the continued safety of my own daughters. Audrey is nothing but a cursed, unnatural monster who stole my family's rightful, aristocratic place. Before Caleb could unleash his lethal wrath and silence her miserable excuses forever, the heavy wooden doors of the main keep slowly pushed open. The entire legion of hardened, blood-soaked warriors instantly dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in profound, undeniable reverence. Audrey stepped calmly out into the freezing courtyard. She was completely unharmed, her very presence actively radiating a warm, ethereal silver glow that effortlessly pushed back the aggressive darkness of the long night. Her jagged, freshly cut short hair beautifully framed her pale face with an undeniable, regal authority. She did not look like a broken, fearful servant girl anymore, she looked exactly like the ancient, divine queen she was always born to be. Caleb's murderous expression softened instantly the second his golden eyes landed on her delicate frame. He stepped back slightly, deliberately clearing the path and silently offering his absolute, unquestioned authority to his pure-blood Luna. Audrey walked gracefully through the bloody snow, her bare feet completely unaffected by the bitter cold thanks to the divine, humming power surging powerfully through her awakened veins. She stopped directly in front of the groveling, pathetic woman who had sadistically tormented her for her entire life. Margaret shrank back violently, completely unable to bear the blinding, pure light actively radiating from Audrey's unshakable presence. The wicked stepmother finally realized the catastrophic, entirely irreversible magnitude of her absolute failure. She was not facing a helpless, crying orphan anymore, she was facing a living, breathing goddess backed by the most lethal military force in the entire realm. You cut my hair to ensure I would be permanently unwanted and entirely unlovable, Audrey spoke quietly, her clear, steady voice carrying effortlessly over the silent, kneeling army. You sold my ancestral secret to immortal monsters out of pure, venomous spite. You fully expected me to break, to beg, and to die in the cold shadows of your endless cruelty. Audrey looked down at the violently trembling woman, feeling absolutely no hatred, only a profound, chilling indifference that scared Margaret more than Caleb's raw anger. Death is a quick, merciful release that you absolutely do not deserve, Audrey declared firmly, her divine judgment sealing Margaret's ultimate, horrifying fate. You value immense wealth, high status, and warm comfort above all else. Therefore, I strip you of your humanity. You will be permanently branded with the mark of the exile. No pack, no village, and no human settlement will ever offer you shelter, food, or a glowing hearth. You will wander the frozen, desolate wastelands completely alone, slowly losing your mind to the endless, biting winter. Caleb let out a low, deeply approving growl that vibrated heavily through the entire courtyard. It was the most brutal, entirely fitting punishment imaginable in the harsh, unforgiving northern territories. At a sharp, definitive gesture from their towering king, two massive alpha guards stepped forward and roughly dragged the screaming, hopelessly thrashing Margaret away toward the absolute darkness of the bordering wilderness. Her hysterical cries for mercy were swiftly and permanently swallowed by the howling blizzard, leaving absolutely no trace of her toxic existence behind. With the treacherous threat permanently eliminated, Caleb closed the distance between them in a single, powerful stride. He wrapped his massive, fiercely protective arms securely around Audrey's delicate frame, pulling her flush against his solid, fiercely hot chest. He buried his face in her short, uneven hair, inhaling the intoxicating, pure scent of the moon that had miraculously saved his entire pack from total annihilation. Audrey wrapped her arms tightly around his incredibly muscular neck, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath as the heavy adrenaline of the brutal night slowly left her exhausted system. They stood completely united in the very center of their victorious army, an entirely unbreakable force of raw, devastating physical power and ancient, divine grace. The raging blizzard finally broke just as the heavy darkness of the long night began to lift, surrendering to a crisp, breathtaking dawn. Inside the inner sanctum of the obsidian fortress, the high-contrast lighting created a masterpiece of shifting shadows and brilliant illumination. Blazing hearth fires cast a deep, golden warmth across the stone floors, while the piercing, icy morning light spilled heavily through the massive arched windows. Caleb stood silently by the massive glass panes, looking out over his entirely secured, heavily fortified territory. His towering, exceptionally muscular physique was a monument of raw, unyielding power, perfectly framed by the stark light. His severe, military-cut short hair and the rugged, deeply carved lines of his jaw reflected the brutal reality of the world he dominated. Yet, as he turned his glowing, predatory eyes back toward the center of the vast chamber, the lethal warlord vanished completely, replaced by a man utterly and permanently consumed by absolute devotion. Audrey stood before a towering silver mirror, completely transformed but retaining the core of her profound resilience. The elite seamstresses of the Northern Pack had labored frantically through the dark hours to construct a ceremonial gown worthy of a living deity. The heavy, midnight blue velvet draped perfectly over her slender frame, heavily embroidered with pure silver threads that mirrored the divine, lunar energy coursing through her ancient veins. She firmly declined the ornate, heavy diamond diadems offered by the frantic servants. She chose to wear her jagged, unevenly cut short hair exactly as it was. What Margaret had maliciously intended to be a permanent brand of extreme ugliness and degradation had evolved into a fierce, undeniable crown of survival. It was a stark, beautiful testament to the indisputable fact that she could be broken, shorn, and cast into the abyss, only to rise higher and shine brighter than anyone else in the realm. Caleb crossed the sprawling room in a few long, ground-shaking strides. He possessed a terrifying grace for a man of his overwhelming size. He stopped directly behind her, his broad chest lightly brushing against her back, radiating an intoxicating, highly protective heat. His massive, heavily calloused hands settled gently on her delicate shoulders, his long fingers starkly contrasting against the soft velvet of her gown. He met her gaze in the silver reflection, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, deeply possessive pride that made her newly awakened soul sing. There were absolutely no lingering shadows of the terrified, abused servant girl left in her posture. She leaned back into his solid strength, absorbing the profound, unwavering security he offered effortlessly. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss to the scarred curve of her neck, right where the divine moonlight had miraculously healed the cruel wounds inflicted by her past. The descent into the great hall was nothing short of legendary. Massive iron braziers lined the sprawling stone staircase, casting intense, high-contrast bursts of orange flame against the dark, ancient masonry. As the heavy oak doors swung open, The immediate silence that fell over the assembled northern legions was absolute and deeply reverent. Every single lord, warrior, and alpha elder who had previously sneered at her fragile human appearance was now completely prostrated on the cold stone floor. Elder Silas, having miraculously survived the crushing weight of her divine aura the day before, kept his forehead firmly pressed against the floorboards, physically trembling in the presence of true, undiluted lunar royalty. Caleb walked exactly half a pace behind her, his towering, intimidating presence serving as a lethal, undeniable warning to the entire world. He was the most dangerous weapon on the continent, and he was completely, willingly tethered to her divine will. They reached the raised obsidian dais at the far end of the cavernous hall. Caleb did not lead her to the smaller, secondary throne traditionally reserved for a consort. He guided her directly to the massive, imposing central seat of the Alpha King. As she gracefully took her place, Caleb turned to face the kneeling masses. His commanding, thunderous voice completely shattered the heavy silence, bouncing aggressively off the vaulted ceilings. He officially declared her not just his chosen mate, but the supreme sovereign of the Northern Territories. He detailed her ancient, sacred lineage, leaving absolutely no room for future rebellion or hidden treachery. To finalize the eternal bond, he drew an ornate silver dagger and made a small, precise incision on his own palm. He knelt before her, pressing his bleeding hand gently against the back of hers. The divine, silver light immediately flared from her skin, instantly healing his wound while permanently weaving their life forces together into an unbreakable, ancient pact. The pact erupted into a deafening, unified howl of absolute submission and wild triumph. When the grand ceremonies concluded and the massive fortress was given over to intense, celebratory feasting, Caleb swept Audrey away from the chaotic crowds. He carried her effortlessly up the winding stone stairs to the highest, most isolated balcony of the ancient keep. The freezing northern wind whipped aggressively around them, but Audrey felt absolutely no chill. She was perfectly cocooned within the heavy, fur-lined cloak Caleb wrapped securely around their intertwined bodies. They looked out over the vast, snow-covered wasteland stretching endlessly into the dark horizon. Somewhere out there in the lethal, freezing abyss, Margaret was wandering blindly toward her inevitable, miserable demise, permanently erased from their glorious reality. Caleb tightened his massive arms around her waist, resting his chin softly against the top of her short, defiant hair. "You have completely conquered my entire world, my beautiful, unbreakable Luna," he murmured into the howling wind, his deep voice carrying a profound, soul-deep peace he had never known in his violent life. Audrey turned slightly in his iron grip, wrapping her arms securely around his thick, muscular neck. She looked up at his handsome, battle-hardened face illuminated by the bright, piercing moonlight. All the pain, the profound rejection, and the endless years of quiet suffering had merely been the necessary, brutal forge required to create the strongest queen in history. "We conquered it together," she whispered softly, pressing her lips against his in a deep, devastatingly passionate kiss. The darkness had tried its absolute best to bury her, completely unaware that she was a sacred, eternal seed destined to bloom into an unstoppable empire.